did? We got snowed on twice when we were in, one in Yellowstone and one's at Pikes Peak. But it wasn't much, but.
They had about 3 inches on it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's
When
those.
does he come home? Pardon me? When does he come home? He won't be home till the end of the month.
Okay. All right, so we finished up Esther chapter 1 last week. Definitely an interesting chapter. And chapter 2 is not much different and interesting. I don't know how often you have really sat down and looked at the things that's said in chapter 2, but it's interesting. And I think to start out with, as we discussed in the last chapter, the writer of this book does not judge the actions of what's going on. So what do I mean by that? They're not adding commentary. They're not saying, okay, this is right or wrong. And as we talked about with chapter 1, the way that women were treated then was not biblical. It's not what we see throughout Scripture and the way God designed for marriage. And that continues in chapter 2, because we got to remember, what kind of nation was this? It was a Gentile nation, and so they did not care for God's laws, and it's not really any different than the world today. Society does what they want. The king did what he wanted. And so the things as we talked about there, these are facts of what happened. And we're seeing how life was during that time and how some people, particularly women, were treated. And we can see throughout scriptures these actions are not approved by God. God does not use people that are wicked. God does use people that are wicked, doesn't he? I think Xerxes himself was being used here in protecting of God's people. That's the theme of the book. God used Nebuchadnezzar. God used Cyrus. God used many nations through the book of Judges to inflict bondage upon his people for their sins. And so it's nothing different. Even though he was a wicked man, God is going to use him to bring about his will, what is the will of God, and the end result is to come about Christ coming and Christ being protected here, the lineage of Christ, the seed line. And so that brings us to the first part of chapter 2. Now, I think I have this in my notes. Yeah, we'll talk about that as we get there. So let's read verse 1 through, verse 9. Somebody want to read that?
After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful, and her father and mother died. Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women.
All right, so verse 1 says, after these things. Now, what does after these things mean? It could mean chapter 1, the things that happened there. But as we talked about in chapter 1, it was believed that this preparation, these feasts that the king was doing, was giving himself time to be able to march upon Greece, gathering all of his warriors from all of his provinces, then to be able to march towards Greece. And so it's believed that between chapter 1 and chapter 2, that is what has happened. That he has marched. Remember, he's in Syria. No, not really Syria. He's in Medo-Persia. So Persia is over here. But he's going to march across the Hellespont. And we've talked about that. He's going to go all the way down to Corinth and Athens area, lose, and come back. And so it's believed that chapter 2 is after this has happened. And so here's a quote. It says, Xerxes had launched his campaign to conquer Greece in 480 BC. The vast Persian forces won victories over a much smaller Greek army at Thermopylae and at Artemisium on the sea. However, the Persians were then beaten in the Battle of Salamis. The next year, in 479 BC, they suffered a decisive defeat at Palladia that brought their invasion of Greece to an end. According to Herodotus, Xerxes consoled himself in such time of distress with the pleasures of women. Now, I added that because of what we see happening in this chapter. And so the thought is that he comes back, so that after these things would have been when he came back. He had been defeated. He had lost a lot of his army. He is pretty upset. Nobody wants to lose, especially him, Xerxes. He doesn't like to lose. And so he comes back. So how long of a time was it from chapter 1 to chapter 2? A few years, a couple years. I don't know exactly how many years, but a few years. And so, he had all this feast. He had this great celebration. He marches towards Greece. He comes back. And when he comes back, notice it says he remembered Vashti. So things have settled down. He has been defeated. He's come back, and from the way the text is written, maybe I may be wrong, it almost seems like he misses her. Does it seem like to you guys? Because it says there, what he says, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. So he's thinking through this, and his servants obviously are hearing him talk about this or seeing his demeanor. To me, it seems like he's regretting what he did. Now, of course, we talked about in chapter 1, he was drunk when he did all the things that he did. So obviously, he wasn't in his right mind. Now that things have settled down, he's thinking, wow, what did I do? Could he change it? Why? Exactly. As we talked about, Vashti had been moved from queen to one of his concubines. And so now she is now lost her position, her authority, and according to the law, she could never get that glory back. So he's thinking about this. Now, the text doesn't tell us that. It just says that he remembered. But for me, how it's written, it seems like that's what he's doing. He's reminiscing. He's thinking, why did I do that? I miss her. And so then verse 2, it says, then the king's servant who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. So that goes back to our quote and saying when he came back, how he dealt with his defeat was what we see in the text here. He's searching for another queen and all that's involved in that. And so the advice to fix the problem he had was to seek out a new queen. And so the officer here, he says, then let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, until the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the king. And let beauty preparations be given them. Let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti, and this pleased the king, and he did so. And so this meant that young virgin women were going to be sought out and brought to the king. Was this something they probably had to do voluntarily? No.
I would say no, because the type of person that Esther was, I felt like she was being made to do it.
Yes. They did not have a choice. So you can imagine what is going on in the kingdom.
Well, what you're saying in verse 3, the appointed officers that they may gather all the beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. And later we see it says that Esther was taken. That word really means it can mean many things, but it really, and I think in the context, means she was dragged. She was taken against her will. And so these virgins are going to be gathered throughout all of his nation. Now, I don't have a map of Persia, but it is a lot. He owns all the way down to Phoenicia, all the way over to Asia, all the way over this way down into some of India, a lot of provinces. What we talked about is 120 in chapter 1. 120 provinces. 127 provinces, sorry. And so these women are sought out. They were brought into protest. And so now some of them may have desired to come because of the chance to become queen. There could have been that. We don't know. But they didn't have a choice. But this is something that I never really thought about until I studied this text. These women are brought to his harem, and they're never going to leave. Ever. The reason is we're going to see that each one of them goes to the king a night at a time, and then they're moved to his concubine house, and they never leave. So these women are never going to go home. They're not going to have a choice in their life. They're not ever going to marry someone. They never get a choice of anything. Pretty terrible when you think about it.
Do you think they're pretty young women?
Yes.
I feel like in those days they married off their daughters quickly. I just feel like they're not very old.
No, I didn't look into what the age would have been, but it says young in the text.
Oh, they were virgins.
Yeah.
I assume that they were young.
Probably young teenagers. And so that's what I'm saying. We're seeing the facts of what happened. And this was the life. This was what kings did. And so that's something to think about. Esther, she's going to be a part of this. She's going to be taken. She's never going to have a chance to leave. And they never did. And so, some may become, she's going to end up, of course, becoming queen, but they're going to end up in the same place that Vashti is now. And so it said that the beauty preparations, there would be ointments, soaps, detergents. These were used to beautify them. And so this idea here, what he came up with, pleased the king, and the proclamation was made. So then that brings us to verse 5. And so now verse 5 through 7, we're going to be introduced to Mordecai and Esther. So in Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew. So we learn about Mordecai here. He is the son of Jar, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So he's from the northern, or not northern, but right north of Judah, Benjamin. Benjamin's right here. Judah, Jerusalem, be right here. So he is going to be from the nation of, or the tribe of Benjamin. And now notice it says he is the son of these. He's the son of Jar, Shimei, Kish. And Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem during the time of Jeconiah. So there was 3 carryings away. 606 BC was Jehoiakim. That was Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 through 12. We can see that when Daniel was taken. 597 was Jeconiah. And then 586 was the third time, the last time. That was the carrying away of Zedekiah. So he would have been carried away in 597, Kish. Now, was it that Mordecai was alive during that time? No. This is almost 100 years later, the date that we're looking at here. So Mordecai was born in captivity. So was Esther. He has spent his whole life in this time, or his life in this nation. And as we're going to see, he still is holding on to his nationality of being a Jew, and doesn't want Esther to pass that along, that's who she is, and so or reveal that. But verse 7, it says, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah. Now, as we talked about in chapter 1, Hadassah is her Hebrew name. And the word Hadassah, the name there, is myrtle. And so it's just another word for myrtle. But Esther was her Persian name, and it means star or Venus. So Mordecai, his name meant, which would have been his, more than likely be his Persian name. Mordecai means the god. Where is that at? Where did I put that at? His name comes from the god Marduk, which means who is dedicated to Mars. He was born in captivity. His grandfather was Kish, who was carried away into captivity, and that would have been 597 BC. And so Mordecai must have been much older than Esther, but it's her cousin. Mordecai is her cousin. A lot of times people, we think about it and it's that she's his niece, but it is, they're cousins. We see that in verse 7. Esther, his uncle's daughter. And so, for she had neither father nor mother. Both of her parents had died. She was very young, and so Mordecai took her in and adopted her, in a sense, and raised her as his own daughter. And we're going to see that she had a lot of respect for Mordecai, and Mordecai loved her. He cared a lot about her. As a matter of fact, we're going to see he was every day in the court wanting to know what was going on with her and how she was doing. And she is in this court. She was in that house for a year. He did that every day, looking to find out how she was doing. But we learn about Esther. Esther says here she was very beautiful and lovely, or lovely and beautiful. Now, both of those words can refer to the outward appearance, but when you look at these words, they also refer to the inward. Her heart matched her. I mean, she looked very beautiful on the outside, but she was very beautiful on the inside. And I think that's why, of course, God blessed her, and she was favored wherever she went because of her character. So it points out a lot of times her beauty, outward appearance, but we also need to remember that her inward beauty was also great here, and that was what brought her and moved her forward in the things that happened later. And so verse 8, it says, so it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young men were gathered to stand the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken into the king's palace into the care of this custodian. Says now verse 9, or we talked about that already, the word taken. The word taken literally means to be forced. So she was forced into this. Verse 9 says, the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor fairly quickly. And obviously, it's because of her character. And do we think about this? Where have we seen this before? Where have we seen this as someone was taken into a king's captivity? Daniel. Somebody read Daniel chapter 1, verse 8 and 9.
You look at this. Mordecai was the said he wasn't raised in Jerusalem. He was a Jew. He's a devout Jew, but yet he was very, I guess, Chaldeanized as far as the customs and all that. And he pointed out, hey, say you don't need to necessarily broadcast that you're a Jew right now. And so you look at that. He was the right guy, but it wasn't this position. And so Esther being raised by him, I think you see a lot of his characteristic. And all that, when you get into chapter 4, which I know you're going to teach that later, but, he's feeding her all through this advice.
Yep.
And she looks to him for wisdom, and does a lot of what she does is because I believe he taught her well, but also she would go back to him for guidance through this. So that's why, Esther's interesting to me, because Mordecai was the right guy, but it couldn't be a guy, so it had to be Esther. She's the right person in the right place, but being trained by an older guy that knew the city and knew the customs of Xerxes and his attitude and personality, and he was clearly involved in what was happening on a social sense in order to prepare her for that.
Which then later he's going to be put in a position of authority because of what we see at the end of this chapter happen. But yeah, you're right. I mean, he had a big part in raising her and raising her right. And we see that she has a great respect for him. She desired his wisdom. She desired his advice. And when he told her something, she did it. Even after she became queen, she continued to keep that till he told her it was time to say something. But yeah, so he's a good man, really great man. Like I said, he's born in captivity, yet he still was a devout Jew. And we see that here. And so the verse 9, she is taken in, she is pleased. And so we see that with Daniel. We didn't read that. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8 and 9. Somebody please.
But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs.
All right, so Daniel was put in captivity. Immediately he was told to eat of something that he should not, and he chose not to. He chose to not go against God. And did God bless him for that? Yeah, he found favor in the eyes of the master at that time. Same thing with Esther. She chose to keep her character and have that good character and to do what she was supposed to do. And even later on, she uses Haggai here. She uses his advice. All the other women made a choice on their own of what they were going to take with them their night. She asked for his advice and listened to him. And so she found great favor in his eyes. And so as we talk about with the book of Esther, we don't see God mentioned, but we see God's providence working with Daniel. Was God's providence working here? Yes. I think because of her character, we see that God was working to bring her favor to the people, to whoever she was with. Joseph was the same way, right? Every time he went somewhere, he found favor with, even in prison, because of who they were and or because they're service to God. And so, yeah, God's not mentioned, but we're seeing God's providence here. And so then continue on in verse 9. She was given, readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. So he was giving her extra because she had favor. Then not only that, she gets 7 maidens, and then she is put into a better place, the best place of the house. Obviously, Haggai wanted to see her be the queen. He saw something in her, and he favored her. Now, we don't see any problems this caused with the other women. It's not stated, but I'm sure it probably did. They could see that she was shown favor. But her care, or because of her favor, she was given the best. And so then verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. So Mordecai had commanded her not to reveal her nationality. Why would this be the case? Yeah, exactly. It could have been that the law in Persia was that the king could only marry a Persian. Don't know. It's not stated. That could be a possibility. It could have been there was some prejudice against Jews at that time because they were of the captivity. But he required women from all nationalities. And it could have been the fact that it wasn't time yet. And Mordecai knew that, as we kind of talked about. And so why, we don't know. We're not told. We're just told that Mordecai, with his wisdom, said, do not reveal that at this time. And so she didn't. And then notice the care and concern that he had for her. He, every day, paced in front of the court of the women's quarters just to learn of her welfare.
And don't you think he'd be worried about what was going to happen to her if she wasn't chosen?
Yeah.
Being that she was a Jew?
Yeah, could have been. She would have still been put into his harem, and he'd probably never seen her again after this. But we don't know. I don't know exactly, but that's what seems like is happening in this chapter, is that if they were not chosen, they were put into his harem of concubines, and they'd stayed there forever. And so he may have never seen her. But he cared to know what was going on. How would he have found this out? I don't know if she was allowed to come out. I'm guessing she wasn't. Maybe the eunuch was going out. Haggai was going out to tell him. Or it could have been a maid, one of her maids. We don't know. But he definitely cared for her and wanted to see her not lose her life, for sure. And so we're getting close on time, but we got a few more minutes. Let's go to verse 12. It says, each woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months preparation. So notice, this is a 12-month process. Why did it take a whole year? It's interesting. It was the rules. Notice it says the rest. We haven't read this, I guess. The rest of the verse. According to the regulations for women, for thus were the days of their preparation appointed. 6 months were with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. So they had 6 months they were using this type of oil, and then 6 months they were using this other type of oil. What else do you think was going on during that 12 months? Yeah, these women came from all over the country, or all over the world at that time. They may not have known the language. Maybe they're learning the language. They had to know the customs. They would probably have been taught how to be a queen, how to act, what things that they had to do with, and that all relates kind of to the customs. But I'm sure that was going on during this time.
Same thing with Daniel. He had his time. He was supposed to eat certain things before he presented to the king. They were prepared too.
Yep. And so, yeah, the preparation here, by law, what was commanded, would have been a year. So Mordecai, for a year, was pacing outside, constantly wanting to know what was going on with her. And so then verse 12, verse 13, says, thus prepared each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the woman's quarters to the king's palace. Now, what would this have been? It could have been a type of garment. It could have been, a gift, whatever the case may be. But she was going to take something. She was given a choice of what she was going to take with them. The verse 14, it says, in the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shahagaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her for her by name. So this is where we see they would go in the evening, they would come back out in the morning, they would go from the house of preparation, they would be moved to the house of the concubines, and they would never come back to the king unless he specifically asked for them. So that's where we get this idea that they never left. Once they came and were taken in captivity to his palace, they never left. They were never given the opportunity to marry anyone. They would be a slave basically for the rest of their life. It is. It's what it is. Because we don't know how many women there was that was brought in. There was many, and we don't know where Esther was at in that line, but this happened for a long period of time. And then each one of those women never got to go home. So like I said, God does not approve of this. This is just facts of what happened in this nation. And Esther was a part of this. She was taken without her choice, and God then used that opportunity to put her in the position that she's going to be, to where she could to do good. Not good. It's terrible to read about, but that was unfortunately the life and the things that were at that time, fortunately. So any questions or comments? We're out of time. All right. Thank you guys for your time.